following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Hello, I'm Carl Seidel, host of The People's View, sponsored by the Nashua City Republican Committee. And if you want, we meet at the Crown Plaza the second Thursday of every month. And if you want to find out more information, you can go to our website at nashuagop.org. Hello and welcome. Tonight we'll be talking to Charlie Arlinghaus from the Josiah Bartlett Center in St. Anselm's. Charlie, welcome aboard.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I was wondering what your view of our happenings just a few days ago at the organizational day for the legislature.
Well, it's funny because the organizational day in the legislature is usually quite boring, frankly. Mm-hmm. Everybody knows what's going to happen. Everybody goes home very quickly, but I think they made you get they got their money's worth out of you.
Oh, they did.
Yeah. Well, I thought it was intriguing, and it's you know, people try to compare it to things that have happened in the past, but really hasn't ever happened like this before, where there's one Republican caucus nominee when Republicans have a majority, and he doesn't manage to win on the floor of the House. I think it suggests there's some bad blood between some people, but to take when you get elected Speaker with a small group of Republicans and mostly Democrats, and then try to govern as the Republican Speaker with the majority of your caucus having been opposed to you, it means that we're going to have a lot of interesting things to watch over the next couple of months. Yeah. What I hope happens, though, is that I care a lot less about who's doing things than what they're doing. And I think that to the extent that we can get legislators and the legislature to focus on that, to focus on the actual output, the actual work product that they come up with, it might calm things down a little bit, because if we're talking about budgets and numbers and legislation and not talking about personality fights, maybe it will allow the legislature to be a little less distracted, although who knows.
No. It is strange, too, that he didn't really make a case for himself at the Republican caucus. He just said that he felt that he might want to offer himself as an alternative if there was a deadlock. And nobody really knew how that would occur. But in fact, I don't think people really understood when they were watching it why Bill didn't win with the large majority that he had on the first vote. It was because he didn't have 50% plus one. And you counted blank ballots and counted write-ins as votes. So those, if you have to get an
absolute majority of that, and I think it's interesting because this is a rule that a lot of speakerships have, and people might remember that when Newt Gingrich was Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, he ended up being brought down because Republicans had a very narrow majority. The Democrat wasn't going to get elected, but he needed 218 votes in Congress. Everybody's there on Organization Day. Nobody gets an absence, and if he got 216 or 214 or whatever, he doesn't get elected, and it's a sign of weakness, and he essentially can't go on. A group of Republicans, I think there were 7 of them, who didn't like the way things were being done, and who knows what the issues were. I'm looking back at it now. I don't remember anymore, but Matt Salmon from Arizona was the guy. He went to the Speaker, and he said, I've got 7 people who are going to abstain. We're not going to vote for the Democrat, but we're going to abstain. And you will not get a majority. You should withdraw. And they spent 2 weeks trying to figure out a way to pressure him, and it didn't work. And eventually, Gingrich resigned and didn't run because he wasn't going to get 218. That rule works because in the legislative body, speakerships are not plurality; they're majority. You need And I think O'Brien was 4 votes short.
4 votes short on the first one, and Jasper was 1 vote short on the second one.
It's funny, and it's the first one I think was O'Brien versus Steve Shurtleff, who's the Democratic leader. And the second ballot, a second Republican comes in, Democrat withdraws, and we presume all the Democrats voted for Jasper.
And some people left too, so the number kept going down a couple of notches. So it was, what was it, after 7 o'clock when we finally
finished. It was a historic event, and I want to say it was almost without precedent, but people might remember, the older among us might remember that The state Senate in 1991, it actually did, I think it was December of 1990, faced something similar. Ed DuPont was running to be Senate president, and there was a group of three, at that time, actually very liberal Republicans. Susan McLean was one of them. Ralph Huff was one of them. And there were all sorts of machinations going on, and they were deadlocked at 12-12, unable to vote. And at about 1:30 in the morning,
Really?
and they'd been going all day, and they couldn't do anything. At 1:30 in the morning, a state senator, who I think was from Nashua, actually, but was a Democrat, went to Senator DuPont and said, you know, enough is enough. I've been voting against you and with my party, but I'm sick of this. I'm sick of the games that are being played, and I'm going to go tell my side that on the next ballot, I'm voting for you, and we're going to end this. And that's what happened, and at 1:30 in the morning. And that person didn't want anything in return or anything like that. She was just sick of the games being played.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think to a certain extent, people were worried about games that might be played, and they looked at the rule changes in a different way. You could look at it the way they wanted to, because you know, they thought that Bill wanted to know who was voting against him and would, you know, give some kind of retribution to it. But I don't think he operates that way. I think the demonization, he's worked with a lot of people that disagreed with him. I've disagreed with him back in 2009 on a point or two. Not 2009, it was 2011.
Sure.
You know, I think he just has that reputation, and unfortunately, I think that's what beat him down. We'll see what happens.
Politics has become very much about personal demonization lately, and unfortunately, if you leave yourself open to it too much, people will try to use that as a leverage against you. I think you're right that played a factor, and that's certainly not a lot of people's experience. I mean, it's certainly not my experience with him at all. And what will be interesting to watch now, I think, is to the extent to which there is a civil war, for lack of a better word, among Republicans, where there is this constant infighting between them, or whether they set that aside temporarily to try to get something done on, well, frankly, the budget is the big task.
Right, and we'll be talking about the budget in a minute, but I did want to add one thing. The House Republican Alliance, I think, is very well organized.
Yes.
They've already got their agendas out. They've got the plan for what kind of legislation they would like to see. They may wind up acting more as the majority than anything else.
We're not used to, in New Hampshire, there have historically been a variety of ad hoc caucuses, people who get together on fire issues or business issues or whatever. And while there's a long history of there being a sub-caucus of Republicans that's a conservative group, it used to be back 20 years ago, it was a very small group. I think they were legislators for limited spending back then, headed by a state rep from Hollis. And they were a much smaller group, and they exerted pressure, but in a different way. The House Republican Alliance, which are the conservative Republicans in the House, has gotten much bigger and much stronger. And I think that the fact that Representative O'Brien was elected Speaker 4 years ago, coming out of that, I think he'd been chairman of that group, gave them a great deal of cachet. And I think you're right that with this weird happening, you're going to see them functioning as at least some sort of a party organization, and if not as the majority, as a very influential subgroup.
Well, I think you're right. They have a lot of past committee chairmen that are in that organization. And they have some very interesting discussions, too. That caucus is a very open caucus as far as people talking all sorts of things.
It will be very interesting to watch for a lot of us who haven't gone through this before, and it's actually a unique setting in a couple of ways. The other thing that I think is unique about it is that there's this big debate on the Republican side. We have a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature, which doesn't always happen. Back 20, 30 years ago, when it would happen less frequently, you'd have a Democratic governor who would form sort of working caucuses of some Democrats, some Republicans, and for parts of his or her agenda. But in recent times, when the parties have become much more sorted ideologically, philosophically, let's say, the last time we had this 4 years ago, the Republicans had a large enough majority that for the most part, on most bills, they could override the governor's veto, which rendered him very impotent because of that on a lot of legislation. This time, there are Republican majorities, but they can't come close to overriding a veto, which means there's something of a stalemate. And I think that'll be interesting to watch how the governor handles that and how the legislature handles
That's
that.
what I was going to bring up, because from what I've heard, the governor really didn't get together with either side that much. They did get together more with the Democrats because that's their party.
Yeah.
But they didn't try to do too much with the Republicans in working the legislation out.
Her first term was interesting because she had the House but not the Senate. I think there was so much of that battle, and the communication lines to the Senate was, you almost felt like she was thinking, we're going to do an end around you on at least on the big issues, and they sort of stood, sort of blocking the doorway, kind of. And I think that the election could have gone either way, and there were people who were saying that, well, if the Democrats keep the House and take back the Senate, then she'll get what she wants. And it turned out differently for her. And I think that when the situation on the ground changes, you have to change your approach. And what remains to be seen is how she's going to change her approach, who she's going to be able to reach out to, and frankly, how the legislature is going to respond. And that's not a partisan thing. That's they both have soul searching and questions to answer, and it's interesting. It's conceivable that almost nothing gets done.
Well, we hope it's still a little bit different and something gets done. Least important. And the first part is the budget.
That's a big thing.
I mean, you've written several articles in the Union Leader about that, and maybe our audience has not read that, but maybe you can go over from your perspective what you think might happen with this budget, because there's lots of fun and games that they can do, and I hope they don't do.
Well, we start out in a fairly bad place. The last budget, and we're finishing up the last budget. We're about a year and a half, not quite a year and a half into a 2-year budget. Budget technically ends June 30th. That budget is balanced in some ways and not balanced in others. It started with the $72 million surplus, and the legislature included that, or included most of that, as part of their spending process, so that the money they do have coming in and the money they're spending don't match, because they're spending a little bit more than they had coming in because they're spending their savings account from the year before. In addition to that, they spent a little more than they thought they were going to spend. In fact, revenues have been really good. The Senator Bob Odell was the Senate Ways and Means chairman.
Ways and Means, right.
So he did the tax numbers. And he was very good at it. He's now retired, but he was very good at it. And we were, 0.1% within the budget. Actually, a little bit over.
That's amazing.
You never ever get that close. And obviously, some taxes are a little high, some a little low, but you hope that the basket balances itself out. And they did a great job. Yeah. But we spent a little more than we thought we were going to spend. So the governor's been talking about trying to cut spending a little bit. She wants to cut $30 million out of the half of state government, out of the existing budget, not the next one, this one, the half of state government that isn't HHS. And in addition to that, there's a $45 million, their estimate, problem at HHS. That's a $75 million problem. The governor proposed recently $18 million of spending cuts. Now, you don't have to be good at geometry to realize that you can't plug in a $75 million hole with $18 million. So more cuts are coming. But what it means is that the base we're starting from, the building block for the budget that we're starting to develop, is out of balance. And out of balance in a fairly large way. So we have to figure that out. You add on top of that a bunch of small issues that add up to big money. There's a mental health lawsuit. There's a significant increase in Medicaid caseloads outside of the federal expansion, a separate issue that's driving some budget numbers. In addition to that, the resolution of the Medicaid enhancement tax, which is a whole show in and of itself, while necessary and had to be done, created a slight drain on spending. There's money that we still have to spend, but money that was being revenues that were being used for other things are now diverted to that. We don't know the exact size of all these things because we're still waiting on some additional information, although we'll know within a couple months. But it's probably a couple $100 million that we have a problem with. That's a big problem to fix. First crack at it is the governor February 14th or so, she will give a speech explaining what she's going to do. Well, when you have a $200 million shortfall, you can't propose much. You can propose cuts, but you can't propose a lot of new initiatives because you don't have a lot of money. Meanwhile, everyone's lining up with requests. The university system wants more money. The community college system wants more money. Every department wants more money. And there's not money to give them. So that aspect is going to be difficult to watch. Then the governor's done. She just has to put together something that looks good on paper, and then it goes to the legislature. Well, a Democratic governor presents a budget to a Republican legislature. One imagines that to some extent the Republican legislature is going to start from scratch, or at least they're not going to give as much deference to her ideas as the Democratic House did 2 years ago. Well, who knows what happens then?
Yeah, and I don't think she's going to be welcome if she thinks she's going to get increased funds from someplace, either taxes or fees or whatever.
Well, I would suspect that based on precedent, she will suggest we raise the cigarette tax again, which I think is, at this point, we're hitting smokers. I have no sympathy for smoking, but we're hitting them pretty hard, and there's a regressive aspect to it that people are getting a little bit sick of. Probably not going to happen.
You might have people selling cigarettes on the street.
Yeah, exactly. It's a great black market. But in addition to that, probably no other tax will go up too. The one thing the Republicans agree on, both House and Senate, and no matter what stripe of Republican you are in the House, with 3 or 4 exceptions, are that taxes are off the table, which leaves one option for her on revenues, and that's gambling. We know that 2 years ago, her proposal was, she had a gambling proposal in her budget. She had the revenue in the budget. She didn't have the details in the budget, which is a little bit weird. Is a change you really have to make. If you're going to propose something new for the budget, you need to have the details of it in the budget too. I could see that coming back again for 2 reasons. She has to get through a speech, and if she doesn't have more money, she has to propose more cuts. And if she does have more money, she doesn't have to propose more cuts. Gambling makes that speech easier to do. She says, this is what I want, and if we get that money, which I know you're going to reject, but if you don't reject it, then I don't have to make another 2 or however $100 million in cuts. And it makes the speech easier.
No, that's for sure. But aren't people going to be aware of the shortfall that actually came out when the details on the gambling situation really started to formulate, that the money wasn't going to come in within the 2-year period?
There's going to be a lot of pressure on that, and there's going to be a lot of pushback on any gambling number because, supporters of it are always optimistic about how much will come in and how soon it will come in. And a lot of detractors are quick to point that out. So she has to be able to make a case for that. But when you're doing a presentation for a budget that the people you're presenting to are going to change radically, basically you can say, all right, here's what I would do. And if you think it doesn't work and you think these numbers don't work, you do what you want. You do something else. And they're going to do something else anyway. So it gets her through the budget. The other thing, though, is what we do know about her is that she really does think it's a good idea. She wanted it, 2 years ago. It was the centerpiece of her economic development plan. I think that she's going to go beyond, or I hope go beyond that, but it's going to be out there.
Yeah, it'll be out there, but I think it's going to be chopped down right away because she can't get the money in quick enough to balance the budget.
My sense is, I think we suspect the Senate is probably supportive of some gambling proposal, and I think the House could go either way, but I think one thing that the House probably all agrees on at this point is that they're going to do a budget without that, and that gambling, if it passes or fails, is going to pass or fail on its own as a policy consideration and not as as just an attempt to plug a revenue hole. So it will be done outside of the budget process.
You referred to some fun and games too in some of your articles. Do you think borrowing can be manipulated in a way that would help her?
I think if the legislature and the governor were all of the same party, there are a lot more games that are possible. One of the great virtues of divided government is that each side doesn't like the other's ideas. they start out, even if they agree with them, not liking them. And so I think at this point, Governor Lynch took a lot of heat over his borrowing proposals. And all it would really do, because the legislature would never adopt it. So I think the governor's unlikely to propose it because she would be just excoriated for it.
No, I kind of agree with you.
Yeah.
I'm just
Not
wondering
that I wouldn't mind excoriating a little bit. I like to remind people sometimes it's good for bad ideas to come back.
Yeah.
So you can remind people that they're bad ideas.
Well, that bad idea of borrowing from the university and taking out 10-year notes for it to pay it back is not a very good way of doing it.
And at one point we borrowed money to pay off our borrowing.
Yeah.
And, you know, sort of like taking out a loan to pay your credit card interest. And it's just that these are all bad ideas. I think the budget that finally comes out is going to, my sense is it won't be everything the Republicans want because they have to, she does have the potential to veto it if it's too much of what they want. But it's going to look a lot like what Republicans want because they get to work on the details. And as long as they don't go too far with it, she's hard pressed to veto because vetoing a budget is a very dramatic act, and it causes a great deal of chaos. And most governors are very reluctant to do it, except under extraordinary circumstances.
Well, what departments do you think, you talked about HHS being separate, and that is 40-some% of the budget.
Yeah.
What do you think is going to happen there? I mean, is that getting too large? Is there some way we can get back and maybe get some better effectiveness out of it and maybe also efficiency?
Well, the thing is that it's a double-edged sword, right? Because it is virtually half the budget. And it's so huge that you think to yourself, what if we broke it up into little bits and we could manage each one separately? There's some wisdom to that. On the other hand, because it's large enough, they have a critical mass in terms of employees, in terms of overhead, in terms of shared services, back office operations, that allows them a greater degree of flexibility in managing their budget. I remember talking to someone once who worked for an agency that had two people, one room, one copy machine. And they had to cut 10% of their budget. And you look at it and you're like,
there's a copy machine.
Yeah, that's exactly what, I think that's exactly what happened. They got rid of the copy machine and they shared with somebody down the hall, and then the one employee gave up her health insurance because her husband had something else too, and that's all they could do.
Yeah.
So you have limited managerial options at that point. If you have thousands of employees, you can redefine jobs. You can combine offices, move around office space, cubicles here, cubicles there, and all these sorts of things. And it gives you some degree of flexibility. I think we're going to see that. And the other thing is so much of that department is not, a lot of it is personnel, but a lot of it is grants to somebody else.
Contracts, yeah.
It's contracts and also payments to, if you think of programs like Medicaid, for example, it's not a person, it's a check being written to an outside doctor for reimbursement for service or partial reimbursement for service.
Or the nursing homes on the county and stuff like that. That's one of the problems I had I didn't get too deeply into HHS, but the number of contracts, the number of those small not-for-profit organizations why haven't they tried to get those people to work together and, form some sort of cooperative arrangement or even merge so that you have maybe less overhead? And
there's a lot of talk about that. I remember Governor Lynch toward the end of his tenure talking a lot about trying to shrink the number of agencies that get grants. And the current commissioner, Nick Tumpus, the HHS commissioner, talks a lot about trying to do that. And I think it makes a lot of sense. I think they're making a little bit of progress, although sometimes it's hard with entrenched agencies. If you have agencies performing similar functions, that makes a great deal of sense. If in some cases you have a grant that is being sent out and it might be sent to an individual, it might be sent to an agency, but it's being sent for a specific purpose. Sometimes whether it's being sent to 10 people or one person doesn't really matter, because either way it's going to be $5,000 to do this service for this client. And to do 10 $5,000 checks or one $50,000 check is no difference, because you're not you're not also paying expenses or overhead or something. But there are a lot of efforts to try to combine things and combine offices, because HHS in New Hampshire is under constant pressure. We have a $45 million shortfall this year. Well, every year they have a shortfall. And every year at some point in the budget, there is what's called a back of the budget cut, where there'll be a footnote to the budget that says, notwithstanding the money we authorized you to spend, you must find an additional $3 million of savings. And come up with do quarterly reports to us on how you're doing on that. And it's actually, I said to someone that you would be crazy to want to be HHS commissioner, because there's so much pressure on that job where the legislature routinely, and governors and the policymakers will routinely say to people, I want you to spend less money, but can you do me a favor and not stop doing anything that you're doing? I don't want you to stop treating any person in any program. I don't want you to fire anybody, but I want you to save $3 million. And you think to yourself, I don't know how to do that. And they're constantly being done. Now, eventually, we have to make, the cuts end up having to happen. But there's a great deal of pressure.
Oh, it is hard, but you can do it.
And and evidence is that it's been done.
If you remember the example with the Department of Justice and how they made the call centers combined instead of having one at every courthouse, how they reduced the number of people, they've done a better job, and they've saved probably $1 million or more just by having that call center. And it just worked out but we had to hit them over the head by saying, we're taking out $1 million out of your budget, but if you do this, you get it back, because we know you're going to save money on the overall budget. And it worked out beautifully.
It's interesting because budget pressures, which we're constantly under, are sort of a double-edged sword. But I had a friend, Doug Hall, who was at the time probably the greatest budget expert of the state, certainly in the 80s and 90s, and he knew more about line items and all this. And people used to say to him, "It's terrible how we don't have enough money." And he thought we needed more money, but he said, "No, the upside to that is that every 2 years we have to have a conversation about priorities." And we have a couple of conversations. One, we have a conversation about priorities because we're struggling to fund what we have. The current revenue sources nonetheless put pressure on us to make changes. So you have to have a conversation. In addition to that, though, if I say to your department, you know what, you can do what you did last year, you're probably not going to change much, because you think to yourself, I don't have any new programs. I don't have any real incentive to save money. So why don't we just, there's 412 of us here. We all know what we do. Let's just keep what we're doing and try to do it well. And we make no changes. If you've got 92% of the money you had last year, all of a sudden, you start by saying, I can't survive on 8% less. And then somebody says to you, but you have to. Well, all of a sudden, your incentive to find savings has radically changed. Now, sometimes that pressure is too much if you make the savings unattainable. But if you make the savings attainable, those people who know what they do better than you and I do, and know the details of what they do better than you and I do, can figure out where the soft points are and where they can make changes. And it's sort of a managerial tool.
I agree, and I think that you're right from a certain extent about people knowing their job, but sometimes that gets to tunnel vision too.
Oh, that's true.
And you don't see the experience of other people, and that's what it took to get that call center in.
Yeah.
We had a couple of legislators who had gone through that with their company and putting things in like that, and convinced them and showed them how to do it, because they didn't believe they were going to save much. Number one. Number two, they didn't see the extra effort that would be developed, and the communication, which meant that if a person over here solved the problem, all the courthouses knew about the solution. And maybe that was appropriate for them too. And that's why they worked out a lot of their savings.
Well, it makes sense when you put it that way. And if you think of New Hampshire's experience, we have 400 state reps. They come from many, many different walks of life. We don't have 400 lawyers, for example, with many, many different experiences. And if one or two people just have one experience that's applicable, it makes a great deal of difference.
Yeah, well, that's I'm hoping that we have a number of new people in there this year with work experience that are different, and maybe they can help out. And I'm hoping that's
every little bit helps, right?
Yeah, yeah. But I'm hoping too that the agencies are all open to that kind of discussion. I know my first year there, I ran into a stone wall, and the stone wall that's going to cost too much to do it this way, and I'm going to try again this year with this proposal and see how far I get, because I think it will help them, help one agency will help another agency by looking at how well the contracts are fulfilled by their vendors.
The thing about stone walls is if you keep hammering at them with a little chisel, eventually you get a hole.
Well, I'm going to come with a couple of chisels, I think.
It's a good thing.
Well, we can go to something else now. The budget's going to be big enough, but
it is.
It's something that's even bigger, pensions.
Oh, pensions. Pensions are always a problem. New Hampshire, as people probably know, we have a pension system for state and local employees, and it's underfunded. Mm-hmm. That creates something, what we call an unfunded liability. Every year, actuaries, accountants measure up what are our assets, what are the assets likely to grow into, what are our liabilities over time, you know, the employees and the pensions we expect them to incur, and we can expect the number because it's based on the benefit they receive is defined rather than the contribution they put in a 401k that most of us have. Your contribution is defined, and whatever that works out to be is what you get. The way the defined benefit plan works is we tell you, what percentage of your salary we're going to give you, and so we make assessments based on that. Well, New Hampshire has a big problem, and it's measured in a couple of different ways, and there are a couple of different shoeboxes of it, but it's more than $4 billion, which is to put in perspective the total general fund supported, the total general obligation debt of the state. Outside of that is not quite $1 billion, and this is 4 times that. We have by percentage, we have one of the worst funded pensions of any state in America. I think bottom 5. I don't know exactly.
Yeah, I think
those numbers change a little bit. And it's not because we're doing a bad job. Our returns are fine. They're not surprisingly good. They're not bad. They're within the range other states do. We did some work analyzing that one year. Where are we compared to other states? Right in the middle of the pack. And that's where you're going to be. The market is the market. But what happens is we have a structural issue. The amount of money we take out of your paycheck your first year, your pension is calculated on the basis of your final 3 years and how much money you make then, which in most cases is a great deal more than you made the first 3 years. And the amount of money we take out your first few years is not going to grow enough to cover your raises, et cetera, unless you're a very mediocre employee, in which case it's great. So what we really want are employees who never get promoted, because we fund them really well, but we really don't want those people working for us anyway. So there are a bunch of structural problems with it. In addition to that, until recently, there were games that could be played with things like overtime. I mean, the idea is that we give you a pension that is a percentage of your salary. And we make it your last few years because the thing is you might have natural growth. Well, there were some professions that made it easy to use things like vacation pay and overtime to artificially inflate those final numbers. So that, famously in an unusual case, a police chief retired and his pension amount, which was supposed to be half his final salary, was actually more than what he had been making because he inflated that final salary. Shame on us for having a system like that. We fixed some of those abuses, and it improved things a little bit, but not all of them. And the thing we need to do is get to a point where we have greater financial certainty for the system. And I think in the future that will mean not switching necessarily every new employee to something like a 401k, because there are a variety of options. We've done some work on this at the Josiah Bartlett Center. If you go to our website, jbartlett.org, there's pension stuff. There are different formulas that can be used, but this is something that affects cities and towns and the state as well. Towns are going to now be required to carry on their books their portion of that unfunded liability, and that is currently being calculated for every town instead of just knowing what it is statewide. So
that there's different situations. Are you saying that you can cover them differently to make people feel like they're whole anyway?
Well, at the end of the day, people who are current retirees are going to get what they're going to get. That's not going to change. People who are close to retirement age, that's also not going to change. there's a point at where what's called vesting takes place, where you are suddenly entitled to and have a property right to your contributions and the promise that's made about how that will be calculated. Before that happens, we have some ability to change that, change contribution rates, change distribution styles. And with new employees, we can probably switch to a system like the rest of the world is using in the private sector, where two things happen. Your contribution is yours. You own it. Like if your money is in a Fidelity account or a TIAA account or something like that, 501k or 401k that you have through work. You own that money. It's not the employer's to do what it will with, or like Social Security is. But simultaneously, you're responsible for it too. And what that grows into is what you get, not some theoretical number based on what we think it might grow into. And it provides ownership for the employee, certainty for the employer. We need to, at some point, move toward a system that has more of that in it. And there are 4 or 5 different ways to get there.
And that might also allow them to invest some of that themselves?
Well, some of it is, you can invest that. Anyone who has a current 401k, there are usually options for how you invest it. As you get closer to retirement age, you become a little more conservative in your investment strategies, usually, or at least you should be. Some people aren't. And so there is that, and you have control over it. But in addition to that, there's a portability of it. A lot of people, these systems were designed in an era when it was thought that if you went to work for the state government or the town government, that was your job. Yeah. And that's the job you would retire from, that you would have the rest of your life. And people had jobs people worked for General Motors for 35 years. Well, we live in a day and age now where people bounce back and forth among jobs. They have a job for 3 or 4 years. They get another job. Maybe it's a better job, but it's at a different company or in a different town, and you move back and forth. And for employees like that, and for most people, and these tend to be younger employees at this point, you want the portability because you don't want to be. You don't ever want someone to stick with the job simply because they're afraid of losing their pension investment. You want that to be portable.
Oh, the health care rights too. How is that being funded?
Well, that's there are other aspects of it. There are retiree health care rights, and and there are two different systems. Other post-employment benefits, they're called, or OPEB. And there are 2 different systems. One is funded by the retirement system and is paid for partially through that. There's a second part of that is not, which is also not funded. We do it on a pay-as-you-go basis. And that becomes an issue as well because that's also not funded. And it's okay if, as a state or a company even, if you're not 100% funded. Because 100% funded means you have every dollar set aside today for everything that might happen. And that's fine. But as you get lower and lower and lower from 100% funding, you have a great deal of risk, and you have bills in the future that you're hoping never come due, but that are eventually going to come due. And a state government, a town government, a county government should engage in long-term planning and not just hope for the best in the future.
It's interesting. There's a lot of things that you got to worry about.
There are a lot of things to worry about. So.
Do you see any other problems with this legislation the legislature that has to be solved, I guess?
Well, to me, the biggest problem the state faced is broader than a single bill or a piece of legislation, and it's economic development. We've talked about this in the past, that the state is not, this isn't the state it was 30 years ago. In the 70s, 80s, 90s, we were a dynamic state with huge job growth. You look around Nashua, you can see the kind of growth I'm talking about. And companies moving in all the time. And we were the envy of our neighbors. I mean, in 2000, the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston wrote a report describing New Hampshire as the envy of its neighbors. And everybody wanted to be like us. Well, they became more like us a little bit. And our natural advantages, we used to have a huge tax advantage. We don't anymore. The business profits tax here, the corporate income tax rate is 8.5%. It's 8% in Massachusetts. If we have any tax that's higher in Massachusetts, we're doing something wrong. And that should be like a fundamental, that should be written in the Constitution. Massachusetts doesn't ever get to be lower than we are, or everybody needs to be fired. So, but in so many measures, whether it's business taxes, we're among the worst 5 in the country, unemployment taxes, worst 5 in the country, workers' comp rates, worst 5 in the country, health insurance rates, worst 5 in the country. Energy cost, worst 5 in the country. There's a trend there. And it's not good if you're a business considering relocating in New Hampshire. To me, energy is one of the worst of them because we want manufacturing and high-tech companies to come here, and they use a lot of electricity, as they're supposed to. But those are the kind of jobs we want. If you're a high-energy using company, you're insane if you relocate in New Hampshire now, because you can't justify to your board of directors and your shareholders those costs when you could save millions of dollars every year by being in North Carolina.
And we have all the electric companies proposing monstrous increases over the next 6 months.
Well, and yeah, and they are, and there's some angst over that at my own Unitil's my company, and the energy charge on my bill went from 8.5 to 15.5. It didn't quite double, but pretty close, and it bothers me. But so much of that is determined by the market, not by the energy company. Your utility doesn't say this is what I want to charge. There's a formula, pretty much, where they plug the numbers in, and the Public Utilities Commission says this is the charge. I mean, they actually do the calculation. And they say, okay, we came up with 9.6 cents, and here's why. And the PUC says yay or nay on that, and they may say lower, they may say higher in rare circumstances, but those errors are rarely made. But it's because on some level we don't have enough electricity, and this, by the way, this is a regional thing. You can't lower rates in one state. You lower them in our case, the 6 New England states are part of a unified market through ISO New England, and we don't have enough energy, and we don't have enough of the cheaper kinds of energy. Because what happens is the highest energy that gets used in a complicated stacking process sets the rate for everybody else. So even if you have, basically we determine we need this much electricity on this day, and suppliers bid into the process. I'll do it for 2 cents, I'll do it for 3 cents, I'll do it for 4. We stack those bids up until we get to the amount we need. And then that price, let's say it's 8 cents, is the clearing price that everybody below it gets. And so if we can lower that clearing price to 6, then these people are all getting 6 instead of 8. It's not, and it affects every megawatt used, not.
Well, do you think something like the Northern Pass and the gas pipelines are going to help that?
Well, to me, those are the two things that gas is cheap now everywhere in the country except New England. We're not that far from Pennsylvania where they're making it.
Right.
And they're not making it.
Even part of New York State.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And and we need to get that here. And the problem is we don't have enough gas supply. It is a particular problem in winter. Businesses are particularly bothered not just by high prices, but by the spiking in the winter that's just so hard to control. I mean, the reason my electricity is going up so much is that for the winter months, the utility can't get cheap energy. No one will supply it to them. They went out for bids and they got virtually none. And so, they don't know what to do. More gas, so the gas plants can operate cheaply, because most of 50% of New England's electricity was generated by gas. It would actually be a little bit higher if the gas plants could run full-time in the winter. So more gas to make that gas cheaper is very important. So a pipeline needs to be built. I know that's very controversial in some local towns. In addition to that, hydro from Canada, from Hydro-Quebec, they have a lot of extra hydro. And if you don't send it somewhere, you just burn it and don't use it. We need to get that here. Is Northern Pass absolutely the right way? I don't know. There's some concerns about that and the routes. But what I do know is that there's cheap hydro in Canada. We can get it into New England. And if that's put into the mix, then everybody saves money. That needs to happen.
Then we have to make sure we get part of that here. It's not just a pass-through to get shipped someplace else.
Exactly. But I think that something people should understand about that is that if it comes into the market, all of the energy, for example, Seabrook is in New Hampshire, but we don't get any extra benefit from it being in New Hampshire. Rhode Island benefits just as much as we do because it's bid into a 6-state market. But the 6-state market gets it. What we need is more energy being produced by the cheaper fuel sources and being available to those 6 states. And there are probably other ways than Northern Pass. If Vermont decides to build transmission lines down Vermont into wherever, and they avoid New Hampshire, that's fine too. They go through Maine, that's fine too. Just get it into the region.
build it along the river valley.
Nothing wrong with that. I don't know. I have no knowledge of the expertise required to do that, but I'm sure there's something they could do.
Well, sure, or along the railroad tracks. There's a number of railroad tracks. I guess everybody thinks it's going to blow up, but one way or another.
I think the biggest obstacle right now, there were some concerns about people about taking of land.
Yeah.
And I sympathize with that. Eminent domain should be used very, very rarely. And that's been put away because they can't do that legally anymore. There are some concerns in parts of, particularly the North Country, about how high the towers are. Apparently, the towers are taller, and even though they're going to be where a lot of towers are now, in most cases, people don't like real tall towers. They think it's not pretty, and it's going to. But at some point, if you're going to use your iPhone, and you're going to use your toaster and your microwave and your dishwasher and your dryer, then we need the electricity to support it. So more gas, more hydro. I'd build another nuclear plant, but I don't think that's ever possible.
Well, they are trying to do something new. I mean, they have got the NRC to approve of these. I think it's 800 megawatt systems, so there could be, you don't get an 1800, you get two 900 or something like that, where they can mass produce them. And you don't go through, everybody gets the same design more or less, so you don't have to go through that complicated 5-year analysis of.
Well, if we could do that, it would be great. I think there's some talk of a new nuclear plant somewhere like South Carolina or Georgia.
Oh yeah, there's several that are on the books now.
They tend to be being built in places where there is a regulated utility, so it's a closed system. So both the investment side of it and the capital side of it and the return on investment is closed. It's a little bit harder in an area where the new plant is an enormous capital investment with an uncertain economic return.
And very little places to put it that isn't close to the people.
I'm told that you could build Seabrook 2, that there's actually...
Oh yeah, there's space
They
there.
started it.
Yeah, that's what it was originally planned.
But I don't want to mislead your viewers. That's not... It's almost certainly never going to happen.
I came from Long Island in New York, and they actually got rid of one there.
Yeah, they're getting rid of one in Vermont on the Connecticut River, too, which, frankly...
But that was age on that one.
It was age, but they could have retrofitted it.
Yeah.
It puts a lot of pressure on our system, though, that when a large plant goes offline, whether it's in Massachusetts, there are plants at Brayton Point that are going to go offline eventually, or it's in Vermont or whatever, it just reduces the total available, and it puts pressure on the system.
It does. And I think people are going to have to realize that, hey, energy goes up, we don't get companies. If the energy goes down, we get more companies, and have the companies and the businesses there at a lower tax rate. We may get actually more money in here to support the budget problems that we have.
One of the most important things for our future is economic growth. Economic growth helps the budget process. But it helps people more than that. It's about jobs.
That's true.
And what we don't want people to derive a greater benefit from government. What we want people to do is to derive a greater benefit from their work. That's what people want.
That's right.
I don't want a great government program to help me. I want a great job to help me. And you feel differently about yourself that way. This state can be that state again. And I think that has to be the focus of everything the legislature does.
I think that's one of the big things that we're doing, where a number of us are trying to do up there. We got to get new companies in the state. Help us all out.
It's very important. It's very dynamic.
I agree very much with you. We're going to have you back, too.
Let's do that.
Sometime after the February presentation. And are you still going to be asked to be one of the consultants in analysis of the budget?
Well, I'm certainly going to do analysis of the budget. I don't know if I'll be asked to do analysis or not, but that won't stop me.
Because it's always fun to listen to you and the several other people there that come up with really good analysis of the details, and that's what we really have to understand.
Well, that's why we exist as an organization.
Well, very good. Well, we look forward to the next time we have a little chat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.